and his newest book right now.
Yes. Hello, everybody. My name's Peter May. You can probably tell from my accent that I'm Scottish, but I've lived in France for the last 20 years. And I think I've just published, I've started to lose count, but I think it's my 27th book, I think. It's either 26th or 27th. I start to lose count around the 18, 19, 20 mark. And it's called The Night Gate. And it's set here in France because I wrote it during the pandemic last year. And, well, I couldn't travel for research, so I had to write about something that was close to home. And The Night Gate could hardly be closer to home because all the contemporary action in it takes place all around here where I live. There are two-story threads to it. One is contemporary, the other one is historic. The historic element of the book takes place in occupied France during the 1940s. And that was something I could research extensively from home via the internet. So I suppose you could call it a pandemic book. The book that I had intended to write last year, I couldn't write because my research trip to an archipelago in the Arctic Circle called Svalbard had to be cancelled last May. That was to be the setting for that book, and I couldn't go. So I had to come up with something new, something different, and The Night Gate is what came out. Inspiration for that was drawn from a blog post that I'd made about an exhibition I'd visited in a nearby town in 1919, no, I wasn't alive then, in 2019. And it was all about the evacuation of art from the Louvre during the war. Everything was removed, all the paintings, all the exhibits, all the statues and sculptures, and they were all crated up and shipped out before the German invasion. Most of them went initially to chateaus in the Loire Valley, and then they moved south after the occupation. They went to various locations. And for the last 2 years of the war, they ended up here where I live. Most of the paintings went to a chateau just along the road from me called Chateau de Montal. But several of the biggest paintings from the Louvre, I mean, vast paintings, were too big to transport. So they'd taken the canvases out of their frames and they'd rolled them around long poles for transportation. And they couldn't get them into the chateau. They couldn't get them through the door and around the angles. So they requisitioned this building in a nearby village, a double garage with an apartment above it. And they stored the paintings in here. And that building is my garage. And that apartment is where I'm sitting right now, because when I went to the exhibition and discovered that this is where they had stored these paintings, I was in the middle of converting this broken down old apartment into my kind of creative workspace. So those paintings, very famous paintings like the Wedding Feast at Cana by Veronese and the Coronation of Napoleon by David, were laid along the floor, the entire length here, just where I'm sitting. So I feel like I'm almost in touch with history. If I reach down, I can touch the ghosts of history. And that became the inspiration for the book.
So, I mean, that's a fascinating story about the paintings. What else inspired The Night Gate?
Well, the fact that I couldn't travel, because I never write about a place that I haven't been to, so I had to use locations that I knew well, which is why I set most of the contemporary end of the book round about here where I live. A lot of the action takes place in a village called Carinac, which is 5 minutes away across the valley here, and it's where I bought my first house in France way back in the 1980s. All that, this whole area became inspirational in terms of the telling of the story. I knew lots of stories about SOE operatives who'd been dropped in under cover of darkness to supply arms and information to the resistance fighting against the Nazi occupation. So it's an area rich in that history and culture. I was also influenced, obviously, by the art and doing my research into the history of the Nazis and their kind of industrial scale looting of art during the war from the occupied territories. That really got my juices going, if you like. And I chose to write about a number of real life characters in my fictitious setting, but using those real people. For example, a character called a lady called Rose Valland, who was at the time of the occupation would be in her early 40s, and she was a curator of an art gallery in Paris called the Jeu de Paume, which the Nazis took over as a depository for all the art that they were stealing. It was taken there and catalogued before being shipped off back to Germany. And Rose didn't let on that she understood German. She listened into all the conversations and she kept meticulous notes. She knew every piece of art that came in and every piece of art that went out, where it went, when it went, who it was sent to, so that after the war, she was actually able to go to Germany and recover, to a very large extent, most of that artwork. So she was very inspirational in the story.
There's so many questions coming in on the stream already. Sally Pello says, "Hello, Peter. Lovely to meet you."
Hi, yeah.
Can she ask for Enzo McLeod based on anyone you know?
Well, a lot of people accuse him of being me, and there are lots of resemblances, I guess, because we were both around the same age when I started to write the first of the Enzo books, and we both had ponytails at the time. I've since dispensed with mine. We both had a fondness for the food and the drink. We both played in bands when we were young and had a love of music, also a love of cooking. So there were many parallels there. So you could say to a large extent he was based on me, but that's not the whole story. I mean, there are fictitious elements of him as well and influences drawn from other characters and other people.
Now, there's a question on here about research, and I want to ask you about your research because I especially like sort of the really strong sort of in-depth science you put in your books, and you manage it without making it sort of dull. You kind of build it in really well.
Try to do.
I'm a science teacher, so I love
Okay.
the effort in the books, and I think you manage it really well. What extent of research do you do before you write and as you write when you're doing those?
I do a lot of really in-depth research, particularly on scientific subjects that have been of interest to me and that I have decided to make the focus for a story. Things like genetic engineering, the gene modification of crops and foodstuffs, the disappearance of bees as a result of the extensive use of herbicides, particularly neonicotinoids. Subjects like that, I did a huge amount of research on. Of course, when you're doing research, well, also, of course, for my China series, one of the principal characters was a pathologist. I'm not a doctor, so I had to find an advisor on pathology, and it's the same with all these topics. I have to find somebody who is an expert on the subject and who is prepared to give of their time and their energy to advising me on the writing of these subjects. And I've been very fortunate in encountering, some amazing people who have been extremely generous with their time and their expertise. Not only have I got a pathology advisor who's been with me now for over 20 years. He was a young medic starting out on his career when I first contacted him. He's now the medical examiner for San Diego. I had a fantastic genetics engineer in Canada, Professor Joe Cummins, sadly deceased, who advised me on all the genetics I used, and that was many books. And he was also a great. He was greatly interested in the subject of the bees and the disappearing bees, and he'd worked on that subject over quite some time and had written a lot of papers about it. He'd addressed the European Parliament on the subject. So I had a lot of background information from him, but I was very fortunate to stumble upon a scientist in Scotland, Dr. Chris Connolly, who had been commissioned by one of the major pharmaceutical companies to do a study, effectively in the hope that he would disprove any link between neonicotinoids and the disappearance of bees. And in fact, it was quite the opposite that transpired. He actually found the link and proved the link, which made him very unpopular. But it provided me with great grist to the mill, great information and great background for the Coffin Road, which was the book that I wrote on the subject.
And you said that that's like, you don't write about places that you've not visited. So do you want to tell us a little bit about your time that you spent in China for the China thrillers?
China, yes, China was a fascinating period of my life. I mean, I was going backwards and forwards to China, writing the China books, roughly from about 1997 to about 2004. I'd been before, obviously. I'd been in the early 80s. So that had been my first visit to China, which had initially sparked my interest in the place and my desire to write about it. I'd gone back in 1991 to Beijing in search of a story, effectively. I wanted to write a thriller set in Beijing. I guess inspired to an extent by Gorky Park, the idea of a thriller, a police investigation taking place in somewhere which is quite unusual, exotic even to people in the West. And Beijing seemed like an interesting place. But, you know, I went back eventually in 1997 to research the first book, The Firemaker. But, you know, this was about research again, and because I was planning to write a central character who was a Chinese police officer, and I knew nothing about the Chinese police, and there was nothing. The internet was in its infancy, and there was nothing on it anyway. I couldn't find any books on the Chinese police, so I needed to find somebody who could advise me on the Chinese police, and I came across, very fortunately, an American criminologist called Dr. Richard Ward, who had passed many years in China, effectively training the top Chinese police officers in the latest Western policing techniques. And I asked for his help, and we met in Paris and had dinner together and really hit it off. And it was he who facilitated my initial trip to Beijing to research, and his contacts that allowed doors that are normally closed to foreigners to open up. And I became the first Western writer to get access to the Chinese police and justice system. And that meant that I had access to all sorts of other things, because the police in China have a lot of influence. And if I wanted to go somewhere, I just had to ask my mentor in the public security ministry if he could facilitate that visit, and he would do it. The campus of Beijing University, for example, which is called Beida, is closed. It's not open to anybody other than students and lecturers. But he got me permission to get in there, and they welcomed me and took me around all the various departments, and they have their own private museum in there, which was fascinating. I got access to all the police forensics departments, the pathology department. I spent time in a a police station in Beijing, a kind of state of the art police station, and spent time in the cells, not as a prisoner, I hasten to add, and they took me out on patrol in the car. Um, and we were befriended by a lot of Chinese writers, taken under their wing, and we got access to all sorts of things and had wonderful experiences there. I mean, it was just, and that period when we were there from 97 to 2004 was, we witnessed an extraordinary rate of change in China. China was just changing almost exponentially at that point. And we witnessed it almost coming from the Middle Ages into the 21st century. It was quite an extraordinary experience altogether.
Is there anywhere else that you'd like to travel to base a novel?
Right now, I'm quite content to stay at home. I've spent much of the last 10 years traveling, living out of a suitcase, different hotel rooms and airports, and I think I'm probably suffering from travel fatigue. I was really looking forward to going to Svalbard. I mean, that's great. I've recently been several times to Norway because the books have been so successful there, and I've been invited several times by the publisher, and I love Norway. We've been all over Europe. The books are hugely successful in the Czech Republic, and I keep getting these invitations to go to this festival in Prague as the guest of honor. And I, for one reason or another, I haven't been able to go, but I'm doing it this year virtually. Like this. Although we'd been to Prague, and we did a tour of. It was Czech Republic, Slovakia, and Poland about 3 or 4 years ago, which was fascinating. I've been all over America, been to Africa, Middle East, Far East. We did a tour of Australia and New Zealand, which was fascinating. I'm not sure. I mean, of course, there are places left on Earth that I haven't been to, but I'm probably all travelled out at the moment. I'd like to just lie back and take a little rest for a while.
Fair enough. So Jason Kelly says, can you tell us a bit about The Reporter and Fallen Hero?
The Reporter was the very first book I got published, and it was written in concert with the development of a TV series that myself and a colleague created for the BBC. It was called The Standard. It was set in the office of a Glasgow newspaper. We made 13 one-hour episodes. And this is, now we're going back away in time now. This is about 1978, I think. And The Reporter was not the book of the series, but it was linked to the series, and it was the same character. And it was the first book that I got published, so it has a special place in my heart. It's probably not very good because it was written so long ago, and maybe I'll go back and polish it up. I haven't read it for however many, more than 40 years, so I've no idea what it's like, really. And I was still working as a journalist at that time. I was working for the Scotsman newspaper. And I just moved on the basis of that book being published. I was kind of headhunted by another newspaper called the Glasgow Evening Times, and a notorious editor called Charlie Wilson, who went on to edit the London Times. And I went to work for the Glasgow Evening News, the Glasgow Evening Times. And while I was there, a publisher called New English Library commissioned me to do a novelization of a television series called Fallen Hero. Now, I'm trying to remember the name of the writer. Brian Finch was the name of the writer, and he'd written this series. I think it ran eventually to about 13, again, one-hour episodes. And it was the first time I'd done anything like this. I got the scripts from the series and turned them into a novel. So I was taking the story and novelizing it, describing the places. I used a lot of the original dialogue, and I learned a huge amount about writing from that exercise, because Brian Finch was a terrific writer. He'd basically been one of the stalwarts of Coronation Street in the 1960s. And then in the 70s, he went on to do the Vet series, All Creatures Great and Small. And in his own series, Fallen Hero, he went on to do other things. And he was just such an excellent dialogue writer. I learned so much from that whole process.
Samantha wants to know, do you get used to selling so many copies of your books? And
get used to selling so many copies of the books?
Yeah, and do you get nervous before each publication day?
Well, I don't know if you ever get used to selling so many copies. I mean, it's nice, obviously, because I can remember the days when I wasn't selling so many copies. So it's always nice when success comes eventually, because it doesn't always. Lots of really good writers out there who don't get the lucky breaks that I eventually did get. So I count my blessings, and I'm very happy, obviously, with the way the sales of my books go. And yes, I do get nervous, because there's always, while to write you're required to have a certain amount of self-belief and self-confidence, and in fact quite a lot. When you've written, the doubt always starts to creep in, and you always start to worry that what you've written is not as good as you think it is, and you start to be concerned about what other people are going to think about it and say about it. So yes, I think every writer will tell you the same story. There's always a certain amount of fear related to the publication of a new book.
There's a few comments about Svalbard. Someone says, hope you do manage to get there. It's one of my favorite places. My dad wants to know, will you have a book based there coming out? If so, when?
Well, if I get there in the end, I mean, it was to be the location, the setting for the book I had intended to write last year, and I developed that story to quite an extent and done a lot of my research on it. But I can't see me being able to travel there before spring next year. And I'm not sure that I'm going to do it. I mean, I would like to go, but I'm not sure that I'm going to write the book that I'd originally intended to write, because ideas have their moment, in your mind. They are hot for a while, and then they can go cold on you. And I'm not at all sure how I will feel about that story, say this time next year, if I was looking at the possibility of returning to it and writing it. So I don't know is the final answer on that.
Fair enough. TG wants to know if you've got a special favorite character from your books.
A favorite character. Well, I'm very fond of Enzo because he's very close to me. I think possibly one of the characters that I had most fun with and most enjoyment in writing in recent books was, I'm just trying to remember his name now, John Mackenzie in A Silent Death. He was the fella that had no social filter, who would just say what was in his head, regardless of what kind of offense it might give. And I had a lot of fun writing that character.
I think everybody would like to sort of be that character a little bit.
Yes.
Sam wants to know if you speak Gaelic.
I don't, no. I know that seems a bit strange because I created and produced a Gaelic soap opera, but we were commissioned to do that. My wife's also a writer, because of our history of writing television drama serial. And unfortunately, we didn't speak Gaelic. We went to a few lessons but it's an extraordinarily difficult language. I mean, it bears no relation to any other language that I can think of. So you can't draw on influences. Um, no, I never ended up learning to speak it. But over the 4 or 5 years that I was working on the show, I I got very used to hearing it, and I got to understand quite a lot of it.
Did you write the scripts and then somebody translated them?
Effectively, yes. There was a team of. I didn't write the scripts because I was producing and I'm contributing, obviously, to the storylining. But yes, there was we had a couple of English language writers who wrote the basic scripts, and then we had a team of Gaelic writers who wrote what we called the parallel text. So it wasn't exactly an exact translation, but that's how the process went.
Jason wonders what authors have been an influence on your writing.
Most of my influences derived from my youth, when I was an aspiring writer and I was reading absolutely everything I could get my hands on. I was never without a book. I would read at night in bed till I fell asleep, and I would be reading every chance I got during the day. And there were lots and lots of different writers that I enjoyed. Probably the most influential would be writers like Graham Greene or Ernest Hemingway, J.P. Donlevy, who perhaps a lot of people have never heard of. He's an Irish-American writer who wrote very particular and individual sort of books. There was one book in particular which had quite a profound effect on me. It was called The Beastly Beatitudes of Balthazar B., which is quite a title. But he wrote beautifully. I mean, just beautifully. The writing was gorgeous, creamy, delicious writing. But he also broke every rule in the grammar book, which was a revelation to me because my dad was an English teacher and he'd spent years dinning the rules of grammar into me. And here was somebody demonstrating that it was perfectly possible and feasible and even desirable to break those rules and produce something that was wonderful to read. And so that had been a real eye opener and was a huge influence on me.
Lucy says good evening, and
Hi.
good evening to Janice if she's watching. She is a member.
Yes, she's right here. She's sitting with headphones on. And Daphne the dog is on her knee. So.
Oh, lovely. What kind of dog have you got?
He's probably about 90% fox terrier. He was a rescue dog, so he's a wee champion.
You can never go. Yeah, all dogs are champions. Sam wants to know. She says you've won so many awards during your career so far. Do any stand out to you?
Well, probably the in terms of my book awards, the one that probably stands out most was the first one that I got, and it was probably the most unusual one because it was an award that was determined by prisoners in French penitentiaries. So that it was called the Prix Intramuros, which translates literally as the prize behind the walls. And it was groups of librarians had whittled a long list down to a short list, and that short list had gone to reading groups in these prisons all over northwest France. And the prisoners had all read the books and had their discussions and picked their favorites. And the book that won it was called Snakehead. It was the fourth book in the China series. And it was the award was presented at a ceremony in Cognac, at the Cognac Film and Book Festival, and having been chosen to be on the shortlist for that, they said you have to go and visit and talk to prisoners. So I had to, prior to the ceremony, and I didn't know whether I'd won or not. I was sent off doing a tour of prisons and going into them and talking to groups of prisoners, male and female. And that was quite a fascinating experience.
I was going to say that must be quite. Was it intimidating or just fascinating?
Well, both. Yeah, it was quite intimidating. Particularly the very first one I went to was one of those kind of 19th century stone edifices with the steel bars everywhere, and it was a grim place. And I'd gone and I talked to this group of guys who seemed kind of fairly sullen and untalkative, and but I did my best. This is all in French, of course, and I talked to them about the books and all the rest of it. And I was quite relieved at the end of that, and the thought of getting back out into fresh air and freedom. And the warders said, "No, you're now going to talk to the female prisoners." So I was taken to another wing of the prison, and that was a weird experience because I was taken up a flight of stairs, and at the top of the stairs there was a long corridor, and all along the right-hand side were cell doors, and they were all open, and the occupant of each cell was standing in the doorway. And I was led down that corridor by the warders, and as I passed each doorway, the prisoner fell in line behind us. So at the end of the corridor, there was a whole string of prisoners, and we went down another flight of stairs and into a big kind of common room with a huge table in the middle of it, and we all sat around that. And it was all these women were, I mean, they were poor souls. They were as much victims of society as anything else. They were prostitutes and drug addicts, and they were a sorry group of human beings. It was quite depressing, and they sat around the table and kind of stared at me quite sullenly, and they weren't interested in participating in this. And so I'm doing my best to talk and engage them, and getting really nowhere at all until I happened to mention that while I was doing my researches in China, I'd had to eat deep fried whole scorpion. And suddenly their interest was caught, the eyes came alive, and suddenly we had this big conversation then about the weird stuff that I'd eaten in China and cooking, and it became a thoroughly animated discussion. And then the warder said, "Finished," and everybody fell silent, and uh, all the women filed out. And as I went back up the stairs along this corridor, they were all standing at their cell doors. And as I passed each one, they went in, the cell door was closed, and they were locked in again, which was a very unnerving experience. And I was very, very happy then to get back out into the street.
I can imagine. Although I do now have to ask you what deep fried whole scorpion tastes like.
You don't want to know; it's horrible. We were. It was at a banquet in Beijing. I was the guest of honor, and my host was a very high-ranking police officer called Wu Herping, and there were about 30 people sitting around this one of these big circular banqueting tables. It was in the Imperial Restaurant just off of Tiananmen Square, and of course, my wife and I didn't speak any English. Sorry, any Chinese, and nobody round the table spoke any English. So there was an interpreter, this woman who was interpreting, and these plates were being brought in, and they said, "Now, as guest of honor, you're being treated to one of your host's favorite dishes." And it was deep fried whole scorpion, and they were brought in and put on the large lazy Susan in the center of the table, and the plate came around, stopped in front of me, and it was kind of piled high with prawn crackers, and these scorpions were placed at various points on the pile, and they looked for all the world as if they were still alive, but they weren't. And everybody looked at me expectantly because, as the guest of honor, I was expected to take one of these things. So I lifted up my chopsticks and I took one, took a deep breath, put it in my mouth, I crunched down on it, and my mouth was filled immediately with this bitter tasting liquid juice. It was disgusting. And I crunched on it very quickly, and I took my beer, washed it down, said, "Very nice." And said, "Have another." And I said, "No, thank you. One's quite sufficient." And Janice had been sitting beside me watching all this with great horror, thinking that she was going to be next. But because she wasn't the guest of honor, she felt that she could politely decline. And the interpreter who was sitting next to her whispered to her, "You're quite right. They are disgusting." And they were.
I can imagine. We once tricked my mum into eating sheep's brains at a Turkish.
Oh, you tricked your mum. That's rotten.
Yeah, we waited until she put them in her mouth before we told her what they were.
Oh.
I don't think she's ever forgiven us. Lucy says she knows that you love music and she believes that you play some instruments. Can you tell us about your music loves?
Well, I'm sitting in my home recording studio at the moment. You can't see, but I have my mixing desk in front of me, and I have 3 screens and through a glass window there. There's the recording room, there's a drum kit and various keyboards and stuff, and I've got my guitars on various sides. I play bass guitar, rhythm or lead guitar. I play keyboards. I play a bit of flute. I do a bit of everything. Jack of all trades, master of none. The one thing I can't play is the drums. So I always have to get a drummer in to do the drums.
Are you in a band now, or
Not a formal band, but the Christmas before last, which was just pre-pandemic, my oldest friend, who now lives in Spain, came up to stay with us over Christmas, New Year, and we'd played in bands together over the years. And the fella who'd bought my house here in France just before we moved to the house we're in now, chap from Leeds, by the way, is a bass player, and my electrician is a drummer. So the 4 of us got together over Christmas, New Year, and had some fabulous sessions, and we really gelled. It worked really well, and we were planning to do a number of other sessions over the last year, and of course, because of the pandemic, we just haven't been able to. So it's been a great shame.
do you speak French?
Yes. My French was not great when I first came here. I failed my O-level French. Well, I got it second time around. It was never my strong suit at school, and I've had to work hard on it here. The turning point came when my books started to be published in France, and my French publisher said, well, you're going to have to go and do these events, book festivals, book salons, as they call them here, in which I'd be participating in round tables and talking to readers. And I said, but, in French? And she said, of course in French, because very few French people actually speak English. And I said, but, my French is bad, and she said, your accent is so cute. They'll love it. I didn't really think that cute was the word that you should be applying to a crime writer, but I took it quite seriously. I did a lot of work on my French, and then doing all these events, you're kind of immersed in the situation sometimes for 3-4 days on end, where nobody speaks English. You're speaking in French the whole time, and the level came up and up and up and up. And my book Lockdown just came out in France, French translation last week. So I've been doing a lot of French promotion for it. I've done a couple of radio interviews. I did big interviews for the big dailies here, Libération and Le Monde. And the Le Monde interview lasted about an hour. The Libération interview was about 90 minutes. We did them by Skype. and it was 100% French. So I guess I'm getting by on it.
What's the reaction been like to Lockdown, the book Lockdown in France?
Quite extraordinary. The media has been exceptionally interested in it, and there's been a fantastic feedback from readers. So it's been really, really well received.
Because that was written quite a long time ago.
2005, yes.
And I read a story that said that you found some problems getting it published because people wouldn't believe it.
Well, yeah, in 2000, when I wrote it, I couldn't get it published because publishers thought it was, as you say, too unbelievable. It was deemed unrealistic to think that a major Western capital city like London could be closed down by a virus. 15 years on, we know different. But back then, it was science fiction, not crime fiction. So I couldn't get it published, and so it didn't find a publisher till basically this time last year.
Would you be tempted to visit sort of viruses and pandemics again? I know you have done it sort of in lockdown and
I've done several. I mean, the first time I did it was actually for Snakehead,
yeah.
one of the China thrillers, where bioterrorists had resurrected the Spanish flu virus. So that had been my first introduction to kind of things viral, and I'd done a lot of research into that at the time. Yeah, I mean, I'm not sure it's a subject that I would fully embrace again because, in a sense, I've been there and done that. But there are related issues which might be worth exploring.
Samantha says you must have been to some interesting events over the years. Scorpions aside, do you have a favourite?
Favorite event? Gosh, I don't. I've had some unnerving events. I In China. I mean, most of the Chinese things that happened in China were probably the most extraordinary things that I've encountered over the years, and there were many of them, and many of them take too long to relate. But the first time that we arrived in 1997 to research the Firemaker, excuse me, we were met at the airport by the Chinese police because this had all been set up by Dr. Richard Ward, who'd been my introduction to them. And we were whisked off through Beijing, and we were taken to the University of Public Security, which is the police university. And we were taken into this large meeting room. And meeting rooms in China are a little different from Europe, where, here we would all sit around a table. There, the room is empty, a big square room, and all the chairs are against the walls around the four sides. And there's little low tables every so often in front of those tables, those chairs with a glass of water or green tea sometimes. And so you sit around the edge of the room, and we were led into this room, and it was full of people, civilians, and police officers in uniform, and they were all sitting around. And the head of the university was sitting directly opposite me, and along at the end to our right was a young girl in a kind of pink dress who was a student and she was the only person who spoke English, and she was going to translate. And she made the introductions. She said, "This is Professor Wong. He is the head of the university, and he is going to say a few words." And Professor Wong started addressing us, and he talked and he talked and he talked, and it went on 1 minute, 2 minutes, 3 minutes. It seemed endless. And because, of course, he's talking directly at me, I had to keep eye contact with him, which is kind of bizarre when you have no idea what the person is saying to you. So I was just kind of sitting and nodding and smiling, and he went on, and it went on and on. And eventually, after about 4 or 5 minutes, he finished. He sat back, and everybody turned expectantly towards the girl at the end of the room who was to translate this. And I'm thinking, how on earth is she going to translate all that? And she said, Professor Wong, he say, welcome. That was it. That was
Nice.
my introduction to China.
Nice summation of the speech, though.
Yes.
Now you've brought Enzo back, are you going to write more in that series?
No, I'd never intended to bring him back, because the series, the Enzo Files series, was, you know, the 7 cold cases that he was trying to resolve, and that was done within the 6 books of the series, and that was it, finished as far as I was concerned. It was only because I was writing during the pandemic, and I was writing a story that was going to be set, you know, the contemporary end of it was going to be set here in France where I lived, and I needed an investigator, that I thought, well, I've got an investigator, Enzo. He's retired. I'll bring him out of retirement for one last case, and that's what I did. So it was great fun meeting him again, discovering what he'd been up to since he'd gone into retirement. But I don't, you know, he's like me, he's getting a bit too old for this game. You know, he's especially far too old to go chasing around and, you know, fighting off villains. Not that he was ever very good at it anyway. But yeah, no, I think we've seen the last of Enzo now.
See, Samantha says, seeing as Janice is beside you, she's got to ask, do you have favourite things that each other have written?
I don't know. Do you have a favourite book that I have written?
Putting her on the spot there.
Put her on the spot, yes.
The Black House.
The Black House, Janice says. Janice's writing, I mean, Janice was a playwright and screenwriter, but she has written a book which was called Looking for the Z, which was a kind of romantic comedy, which I enjoyed very much. And the character in that was very much influenced my writing of the character of Margaret Campbell in the China series, because Janice had written that book just before I started working on The Firemaker. And so there was some cross-fertilization there.
Margaret's a brilliant character as well. That's interesting.
Well, it's interesting. Quite a lot of people are ambivalent about Margaret. Some people don't like her very much because they think she's too abrasive and too outspoken, and too impulsive. And I would say that's true of quite a lot of readers. I would say I'm mostly female readers who are ambivalent about her in Britain and in America. And what's interesting is the cultural difference, because in France, my female readers in France absolutely love Margaret. I mean, there's a fantastic response to that character here. I think she's much more beloved in France than in the Anglo-Saxon world.
Well, she's got a fan here in this.
Well, yes. But
Saxon world. Ruth Murphy says, do you have any plans to write any more novels set in Scotland?
I have no plans to write anything at the moment, because I'm just stepping back. I'm going to take a wee break. I've been producing a book or more than a book a year for the last 20 odd years, and this last year in particular has been extraordinarily hectic. In spite of the pandemic, I've published 3 books in the last 12 months or 15 months. it's all been quite demanding. So I'm of a mind to just sit back and take a little bit of a rest and wait and see what comes to me. But I might write the Svalbard book. I don't know. I'm. I mean, I wouldn't rule out Scotland. It's all about getting the right idea and embracing the right character for that idea. But for the moment, I'm looking forward to spring and summer of good weather, lying about, swimming, sunbathing, reading, drinking. That's my ambition for the next few months.
Have you got any good books lined up for that break?
I've got a ton of books lined up for it, and I'm kind of dying to get into them. Yes, because reading for pleasure is something I haven't had much time to do in the last goodness knows how long. Most of my reading has been research reading. Just reading for pleasure. In fact, the only time I really got to read for pleasure was when I was on promotional tours. Because usually my books would come out in January and I'd come to the UK and do a promotional tour for that book. And I carried the Kindle. I know that's anathema to many book lovers, but if you're traveling, you can't carry a bag full of books because they're too heavy. But the Kindle was great because it meant I could carry any number of books with me, and I would read on trains and planes and hotel rooms. And it's the same when we went traveling to the States or down to Australia. That's the only time really I've had to read for pleasure. Now I'm at home. I've got a favorite chair in the house and one in the garden if there's good weather, that I can sit and read and just get back to those halcyon days of my youth when I was always with a book in my hand.
I think it's when you're one of those people that always has a book in the hand as well. It's so nice when you get the chance to do that again, isn't it?
It is, yeah.
Been
Looking
busy.
forward to it.
Samantha says it's interesting to hear that characters are received differently in different countries. Did that surprise you?
Not really. I mean, I think you notice if you do a lot of traveling or if you live in different countries, as I've done, you do notice that there are cultural differences and perceptions of people and characters, and even subject matter. Some things really chime with a British readership that don't really work in France, or sometimes even in America, or something that really works in an American context doesn't really take off in the UK. I mean, these are really cultural differences, and characters fall into that same category. Some characters, I'm not sure how the character of John Mackenzie, for example, went down in the United States. I think it's a character that was of far more appeal to a British readership. I'm not sure that the book was well received in France, actually, so that character was well received. It's interesting, though, that I mean, I've written a lot of standalone books, and very often people will read the latest standalone book, and I get a flood of comments on Twitter or on Facebook saying, "Is this the first of a series? We'd like to see more of this character." And you get to be able to gauge just how successful or not a character has been with an audience when you get a strong feedback like that and people want more of the character. The John Mackenzie character was a classic example. I was inundated with people saying we want more of John Mackenzie. So that idea of somebody who is without the social filter clearly appealed to people.
Would you ever be tempted to bring one of those back?
No.
No.
For years in television, I wrote series or serial drama with the same characters over and over and over again. I've only written 2 series in books, really, the China thrillers and the Enzo files. And these things for me, they have to come to an end, because there's a limit to how much you can plumb from a character. After a while it just starts to become repetitive or perfunctory. And I like the challenge of fresh characters, fresh relationships, a fresh setting, rather than keep treading the same path over and over. So while I understand absolutely why readers like series, I mean, I do as a reader, I understand very much why people want. There's a certain comfort in going back to the same characters, a familiarity, and people enjoy that. But I think, from my perspective as a writer, I like to move on.
And Nikki Smith, one of the author members in our group, said, is it easier to write the second or third in a series or a standalone?
That's difficult to know. The China series, I guess, would be my only real experience of that, because the Enzo series, that was something I planned. I planned the 6 books right from the outset, and I had worked out my storylines through that. That were the rough plots for each book and the story threads that would run through it and the characters. I'd done all that work, so I actually planned that as a series. Whereas the China series was never intended to be a series. I wrote the Firemaker as a standalone book, and it was only when the publisher who expressed an interest in publishing it said that they would offer me a 2-book contract if I wrote another book in the same setting with the same characters, and I couldn't resist that offer, that it then turned into a series. And every year I went back, they said, we want more China, we want more China, we want more China. So I was kind of, in a way, forced down that series road. And it was a challenge. Every book was a challenge. I mean, the first one was fresh because it was only ever viewed as the standalone. But of course, you have to think then about your character development and the relationships and how they develop. And so very often those things which are self-contained within a first book or a standalone book become much more important in subsequent books as it becomes a series, and you spend more time on character and relationship, and the plot perhaps becomes less important, but it's still important. But there's a difference, most definitely a difference in the approach. And I think I find it quite difficult each time to sit down and come up with a new development for those characters, and take their relationship to the next stage.
We've only got a couple of minutes. I'm going to ask you a question by Ruth Murphy. She says, would you like the Hebrides trilogy to be televised?
Well, the BBC did buy the rights at one point, and but I very quickly became disabused with what they were doing and the direction that they were taking it, and pulled out at a very early stage. And I think I think if it was well done, if it was adapted sensitively and filmed well on location with a good cast, it could be quite a compelling series. But I'm not at all confident that the people who've offered for it so far were people who would be capable of doing that. So up until now, I've said no, and until somebody comes along with a really good offer, something that's going to do it justice, then I'll continue to say no, because I'm happy for them to stand in their own right.
Would you be tempted to be involved in the television version if there was one?
Not really, no. I had my belly full of television over 20 years. I enjoyed my time in television, but yeah, it was time to move on. It's a team game, and now I'm a solo player. As a novelist, it's just you, and that's the way I like it.
Makes sense. So would you like to sort of remind us a little bit about the Nightgate before we finish off?
The Nightgate, I can't remember what I told you about it at the beginning, but I don't think I told you how it opens. But it starts with the contemporary storyline. A famous French art critic is murdered in a house in the village of Caranac, just across the valley there. And coincidentally, a few days prior to that, a storm had blown down a tree in the park next door to the house, and the roots had brought up with them the body of somebody shot through the head 70 years before. And Enzo becomes involved in first the old cadaver, because cold cases are his speciality, but very quickly becomes embroiled in the investigation of the most recent murder. And he very quickly discovers that there's a link between the two, and that link is the Mona Lisa.
Sounds intriguing. For anyone who's watching, I dropped a link to you can buy signed copies at Waterstones, I believe.
That's correct, yes.
Yeah, so that's in the group if anyone's interested. And I'll finish off by saying thank you so much for joining us. It's been an enjoyable hour.
It's been my pleasure. Thank you.